Have you ever seen something so ancient, so strange looking, that you had to stop and ask, wait, is this even real? That's exactly the feeling people get when they lay eyes on the Ethiopian Bible for the first time. It doesn't look like your regular Bible. In fact, it feels like something ripped straight from a treasure hunt movie, like Indiana Jones might have been chasing after it. Only this isn't a Hollywood prop. This is real. This is the Ethiopian Bible, and it's one of the most mysterious, most controversial spiritual texts in the world. But before we dive into the book itself, we need to talk about where it comes from, because Ethiopia isn't just another country. It's a land wrapped in ancient secrets and powerful legacies. It's home to one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, and maybe even more importantly, it's the only African country that was never colonized. Let that sink in for a moment. That independence allowed Ethiopia to protect its heritage, its language, and its faith in a way that most nations simply couldn't. And because of that, Ethiopians trace their lineage all the way back to Ham, one of the sons of Noah. That's not a wild claim either. This idea is backed by ancient Jewish traditions. But this story isn't about Ethiopia's politics or its sovereignty. This is about what Ethiopia preserved, something that the rest of the world has largely forgotten, ignored, or never even heard of. An ancient Bible, unlike any other. So, here's what makes it so unique. The Ethiopian Bible contains some of the oldest known biblical scrolls in existence, older than the King James Version. While most Bibles today contain 66 books, the Ethiopian Bible has 88. That's right, it includes everything in the traditional Bible, but also books that were excluded, lost, or hidden away from the rest of the Christian world. It includes Old Testament writings, New Testament accounts, and even scriptures that don't appear in any other mainstream Bible. And here's the wild part. Ethiopians had these scrolls before Christianity was ever officially introduced to their society. Wait, what? Yeah, while most countries received Christianity as a religion from the outside, through colonization, missionaries, or conquest, Ethiopia already had Christian roots as early as the 4th century. They weren't given Christianity, they lived it. For over 1,600 years, Ethiopia has been a Christian nation, and according to early records, maybe even longer than that. One of the first people to document this was a 6th century traveler named Cosmas Indicoplastes, an Egyptian monk and historian. He visited Ethiopia and noted that Christianity was already well established there. The rulers were so committed to their faith that they opened their borders to Christian refugees who were fleeing persecution from the Roman Empire. And some Ethiopian tribes, they've been worshiping the Christian God for over 3,500 years. Let that sink in. All of this means something shocking. The oldest organized Christian church in the world is not the Vatican. It's not Rome. It's not even the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, locally known as Tewahedo. This church isn't just old, it's rich with history that most Christians have never heard of. For example, Ethiopia is home to one of the earliest illustrated Christian texts ever discovered. It's part of the Gospels, written in an ancient Ethiopian language called Ge'ez. And it was found in 2010 in a hidden monastery perched on top of a remote mountain. That's not just history, that's sacred legacy. And speaking of legacies, let's talk about one of the most legendary connections between Ethiopia and the Bible, the story of the Queen of Sheba. According to Ethiopian sacred texts, the Kebra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem around the 10th century BC to seek the wisdom of King Solomon. Now, that part is actually in the Bible, but what the traditional canon doesn't mention is that the Queen and Solomon had a child together, a boy named Menelik. Queen Sheba brought Menelik back to Ethiopia, where he became the first emperor. That makes Ethiopia not just a country with biblical ties, but a country with direct bloodline connections to one of the most important figures in Jewish and Christian history. And here's the kicker.
In 2012, modern genetic studies found evidence that supports this ancient claim. Researchers found genetic links between Ethiopians and populations from Egypt, Israel, and Syria, dating back nearly 3,000 years. That's the same period when the Queen of Sheba supposedly visited Jerusalem. So, with all of these historical and genetic links, why have most people never heard of the Ethiopian Bible? Why is it not considered part of the mainstream Christian canon? Why, despite its authenticity, age, and spiritual significance, has it been so thoroughly hidden? To answer that, we need to take a quick dive into Bible history. And trust me, this will explain a lot. See, the Bible we know today didn't just fall out of the sky one day. It went through centuries of edits, debates, translations, and even political manipulation. Originally, the Bible's texts were written in Hebrew. Then they were translated into Greek, Aramaic, and eventually Latin. The most famous early translation was by Saint Jerome, who translated the scriptures into Latin in the year 400. That version became known as the Vulgate, and it remained the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. But here's the thing. There were lots of books written about Jesus and early Christianity in those early centuries. Some were true, some were total fiction. They were like fan fiction novels written by people who were fascinated by Jesus but didn't actually know him. And because there was no internet, no fact-checking, and no central authority, these books started to spread like wildfire. That terrified the early church leaders. So in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, and again in 381 at the Council of Constantinople, church leaders gathered to decide which books would be included in the official Bible and which ones would be thrown out. Their criteria was a book had to be written by someone who either knew Jesus personally or was directly connected to someone who did. It also had to be written in the first century and align with the rest of the scriptures. But even after that, the process didn't end. Fast forward to the 1600s. King James I of England is sitting on the throne, and he's concerned that too many versions of the Bible were floating around. They all said different things, some were poorly translated, others were politically biased. So King James decided to unify the Bible and commissioned a new English version. He brought together 47 scholars, split them into 6 groups, and had them work independently on different sections of the Bible. They spent 7 years cross-referencing texts, going back to Hebrew and Greek and removing any bias. The result was the King James Bible of 1611, a version that became so widespread it eventually overshadowed almost everything else. But here's the cost of that process. Many ancient scriptures were removed. Some were labeled as heretical or pseudo-epigraphs, a term used for writings falsely attributed to biblical figures. And because of that, books that had been considered scripture for centuries were suddenly erased from mainstream Christianity. But not in Ethiopia. Ethiopia kept those scriptures, and that's where the mystery deepens.
So by now, you're probably asking the big question. Why did Ethiopia hold on to the books that the rest of the Christian world rejected? And more importantly, what exactly was in those books that made them so threatening? Well, to understand that, let's start with the word canon. In the biblical world, a canon isn't a weapon. It's a rule, a measuring stick. A canon is the official list of books considered divinely inspired, sacred, and authoritative. But what most people don't realize is that the idea of a closed canon, that is, a final, unchangeable list of books, was not how early Christianity worked. Early Christians read many writings, including letters, prophecies, visions, and gospels that we don't see in most modern Bibles. Over time, church leaders decided some of these books didn't meet the criteria. They were considered pseudepigrapha, which literally means false writings. Basically, pseudepigrapha are books that claim to be written by biblical figures like Enoch, Baruch, or Ezra, but weren't, at least according to the mainstream scholars of the time. Many of these texts were said to be too mystical, too far-fetched,
or just too controversial to include in the official Bible. Some were even accused of having hidden agendas or heretical theology. But Ethiopia? Ethiopia kept them. Their broader canon includes 81 books, and it's not just more quantity, it's more depth. It includes texts like the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, the Book of Tobit, and multiple writings attributed to figures like Baruch, Clement, and even Mary. There are also documents like the Book of the Covenant, the 3 books of Maccabean, and the Ascension of Isaiah, all of which are almost completely unknown in the West. Now, let's be fair. There were legitimate concerns in the early church about false teachings. Imagine if today someone published a book claiming that Kobe Bryant wasn't a great athlete. Most of us would laugh it off or be outraged, right? But 500 years from now, if that book still existed and people didn't know the truth, someone might start believing it. That's what the early church was afraid of. So to protect the faith from being distorted, they cut out any book they weren't 100% sure about. But here's the problem. What if, in their effort to protect the truth, they also buried parts of it? What if some of the books they removed were actually vital pieces of the puzzle? Books that explained hidden teachings, ancient prophecies, or divine visions? That's what makes the Ethiopian Bible so powerful. It preserves those lost pieces. It offers a completely different lens on early Christianity, one that's deeply mystical, symbolically rich, and culturally unique. Now, let's clear something up. Even within Ethiopia, the Bible hasn't been totally unified. There are actually 2 versions of the Ethiopian canon, the broader canon and the narrower canon. The broader canon is the more well-known one, and the one most people refer to when they talk about the Ethiopian Bible. It includes 81 books, everything in the traditional Bible, plus the so-called lost scriptures. This is the version that preserves books like Enoch and Jubilees. But then there's the narrower canon, which was established during the reign of Emperor Haile Selassie in the 20th century. He publicly proclaimed this narrower version as the official canon of Ethiopia, reducing the number of books to 72. That's still more than the King James Bible, but less than the older Ethiopian canon. Why did he do that? Well, let's just say it's a controversial move. Some say it was political. Others believe it was about aligning the Ethiopian church more closely with other global Christian movements. And then there are those who believe it was something deeper, maybe even something spiritual. Whatever the reason, the broader canon, the one with all 81 books, hasn't been reprinted widely since the early 1900s. That means this full version of the Ethiopian Bible is becoming harder and harder to access. And that's not just sad. It's strategic. Because if fewer people can read these texts, fewer people will question why they were left out in the first place. One major reason the Ethiopian Bible remains obscure is its language. The entire Bible was written in an ancient liturgical language called Ge'ez. It's no longer spoken as a daily language and is mainly used in religious settings, sort of like how Latin is used in Old Catholic masses. Because of this, most people outside of Ethiopia can't read it. And for centuries, there were almost no translations into English or other modern languages. Combine that with Ethiopia's geographic isolation, its unique theological traditions, and its resistance to colonization, and you start to see how this sacred text managed to fly under the radar. But let's not pretend that language and location are the only reasons. There's also power and politics. You see, when Christianity was formalizing its institutions, especially in Rome, the leaders weren't just focused on spiritual purity, they were focused on control. Rome was an empire, and empires need order, structure, and unity. That meant establishing one official version of Christianity and silencing the rest. Anything that didn't fit their narrative was labeled heresy. Any text that challenged their authority was banned. Some were burned, others were hidden, and yet a few somehow survived. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls were such a huge discovery in the 1940s. Hidden in clay jars in desert caves, these ancient documents included books and fragments that didn't appear in the modern Bible, many of which lined up with texts found in the Ethiopian canon. So if these non-canonical books were preserved by ancient Jews and by Ethiopians, but rejected by the Roman Church, maybe they weren't so heretical after all. Maybe they were just inconvenient. In recent years, interest in the Ethiopian Bible has grown dramatically. Scholars, theologians, and curious seekers are now asking questions they weren't allowed to ask before. What secrets does this Bible hold? Why does its pages speak with such a different tone? And what might we learn, not just about God, but about the history of belief itself? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has started translating more of its scriptures into English and other global languages. Academic institutions are beginning to study them more seriously, and for the first time in centuries, the voice of ancient Ethiopian Christianity is starting to be heard. And here's the part that blows people's minds. This Bible, this sacred text that has survived war, colonization, fire, and suppression, is still in use. It was attacked, it was hidden, it was forgotten, but it wasn't destroyed. And that alone makes it one of the most fascinating spiritual artifacts in the world.
So now we've unpacked the mysterious origins, the excluded books, and the politics that tried to erase the Ethiopian Bible, but what does it all mean? Why does this ancient text matter today? Well, here's the thing most people overlook when they think about the Bible. It's not just one book. It's a collection, a library of spiritual experiences, visions, prophecies, and historical records gathered across thousands of years. And when you start to realize that different cultures preserved different pieces of that library, you begin to see just how fractured our understanding of early Christianity really is. Take the Book of Enoch, for example. It's one of the most famous writings preserved in the Ethiopian canon, and it's massive in terms of spiritual insight. This book dives deep into the world of angels, demons, fallen beings, and the cosmic battle between light and darkness. It even describes events that sound a lot like the flood of Noah, but with extra layers that were stripped out of the mainstream Bible. Why was this removed? Because it was too strange? Too mystical? Or maybe too true? Another example? The Book of Jubilees. It retells many Old Testament stories, but includes timelines, details, and laws that never made it into the traditional canon. It gives insight into how ancient Jews viewed time itself, describing history in 49-year cycles called Jubilees. It's a book about divine order, cosmic justice, and covenant memory, and it offers a glimpse into a worldview that's mostly been lost to time. Now, imagine these weren't just philosophical side quests. Imagine they were meant to be part of the original understanding of faith, and we just lost them. And then there's the question of identity. For Ethiopia, these scriptures aren't just historical, they're part of their national soul. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church isn't some offshoot sect. It's one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth. It carries with it a completely different spiritual DNA. It worships in an ancient language. It maintains traditions and rituals that predate Rome. And it has survived the kind of political and religious oppression that would have destroyed most other faith systems. But somehow, it's still standing. Even when Muslims invaded, even when Italy tried to colonize the nation, even when fire consumed the very monastery that housed some of these sacred scrolls, the Ethiopian Bible survived. Let that sink in. This book was meant to be erased, and yet it endured. So here's the big question that modern seekers are beginning to ask. What are we missing? What spiritual truths lie buried in the Ethiopian Bible that could completely reshape how we understand Scripture, prophecy, and even God? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the King James Bible or the Catholic Bible is wrong, but it's incomplete, just like a puzzle with missing pieces. And when you put those pieces back together, when you bring in the lost books, the exiled prophets, and the overlooked voices, you start to get a much clearer picture.
In fact, many scholars today are starting to view the Ethiopian Bible as a kind of time capsule, a preserved window into what early Christianity might have actually looked like before it became institutionalized, westernized, and sanitized. And the differences aren't just in content, they're in tone too. Mainstream Bibles tend to feel structured, systematic, and, let's be honest, safe. But the Ethiopian Bible? It feels wild, it's raw, mystical, full of visions and cosmic battles and ancient wisdom. It's not afraid to talk about spirits, supernatural realms, divine visitations, and the unseen forces that shape our world. That's why so many people today, especially those exploring spirituality outside of traditional church walls, are drawn to it, because it speaks to a deeper, more symbolic layer of faith. It speaks to the mystery. And mystery matters. Mystery is what keeps our faith alive. It's what reminds us that we don't have all the answers, and that maybe, just maybe, God is bigger than the narrow lens we've been handed. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. In recent decades, some Ethiopian churches and scholars have begun translating these ancient texts into English and other global languages. For the first time in history, the world is getting access to these writings, not just in academic libraries, but online, in public. The veil is lifting. And what people are discovering is both fascinating and a little unsettling. Because if these books were so dangerous to be hidden for centuries, what does that say about the people who removed them? What were they trying to protect or, more importantly, control? Power has always been wrapped up in religious texts. The more you control the scripture, the more you control the narrative. And the more you control the narrative, the more you control people. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just human history. And yet, the Ethiopian Bible stands outside of all that. It was never edited to serve an empire. It wasn't written to flatter a king. It wasn't trimmed to fit a political agenda. It simply survived, untouched, uncolonized, and largely unread. Until now. So, what do we do with all this? Here's what I'd say. Don't take my word for it. Go explore. Look up the Book of Enoch. Read the Book of Jubilees. Search for the writings of Maccabean or the story of Baruch. Compare them with the scriptures you already know. See what fits. See what resonates. Because maybe, just maybe, the truth wasn't lost. Maybe it was just waiting. Waiting in a monastery on a mountain. Waiting in a forgotten tongue. Waiting behind centuries of silence and smoke and ash. Waiting for you. So if you've ever felt like there's more to the Bible than what you've been taught, if you've ever had questions that mainstream religion couldn't answer, then the Ethiopian Bible might be the missing link in your spiritual journey. It's not just a book, it's a challenge, a mirror, a call to awaken the parts of your faith that were never meant to sleep. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden to protect us. Sometimes it's hidden to test who's willing to look for it.